So we're having an interview this morning with Peter Gibbs, and I'll let him introduce himself.
My name is Peter Gibbs. I'm a Gamilaroi man from northwest New South Wales, but I grew up in a little community called Weilmoringle, and that's Gamilaroi country. But my great-grandfather moved there many years ago and raised his family, so that's my heritage. So Weilmoringle is in the far west of New South Wales, and it's on a little river. It's a tributary of the Darling River. Everybody knows the Darling. A little river called the Colgoa. And there's a part of that river that never goes dry, even in the most severest of droughts. So the Gamilaroi people settled there generations ago. And my family were moved there through my great-grandfather to work on raising stock in the early days. So many of my family became fencers and shearers, and so that's pretty much how you grew up, basically. If you were going to work, you worked on the land, and many of my family are very good shearers, and shearing is still in our generations now. And so that's a rich heritage in my mother's side of my family. My father's family are from the Angledoo, which is just on the Queensland border, and it's rich there in cultural heritage as well. And even today, people have a strong affiliation with Angledoo in the northwest of the state.
So does that mean that you spend a lot of time going backwards and forwards?
We spend a lot of time visiting our family. The great thing is that I live in Dubbo, and Dubbo now has become the centre for many things, particularly health and education. So if you were going to be born in today's times, you'll be born in Dubbo. There's no babies delivered west of Dubbo now. So my generation, back in '66, were the first generation of children from our little community that were born in hospitals. Prior to that, you were born on your community. So, but today, it's sort of gone backwards because you can't be born west of Dubbo. So a lot of our families are being caught in this system, putting themselves and their children at risk because you can't go to your local hospital and be born. But further to that, you haven't got that midwifery skill and knowledge in your local community anymore like you did generations ago, where our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers helped babies be born, and that has also been lost. So I fear for mums or mums-to-be in our generation because of this dramatic impact on services being withdrawn from far west New South Wales, where back in '66 you just take it for granted that you can't be born in your community. You need to go to hospitals. Well, unfortunately, these things are changing even today.
Wow, that would have such a huge impact, particularly on families who don't have the transport. What do they do?
Even today, with modern transport and hospitals and health facilities and Aboriginal medical services, this is still a dilemma for many families, both black and white, west of big cities, big country centres like Dubbo. People are being born on the road. People are coming by ambulance, by aeroplane, to deliver their babies at the last moment. For Aboriginal people, it's common knowledge that they're not necessarily accessing the antenatal care that's available services in their community right now. They're leaving it to the last moment. So this is a really interesting twist in the way we talk about services and being provided not just to Aboriginal people but to communities where services are starting to dry up. And because we're small populations, in my little community, there's only just under 100 people live there. We just had a sealed road done in the last 15 years that gives us access to a smaller centre, a small centre in Western New South Wales called Weilmoringle. So, but even with that advance, having a sealed road that you can access when there's rain and floods, it still does not connect us into important services like having babies born in safety.
So for rural communities, it's almost like they're trying to close down those rural communities.
I think the concept of the small communities and the argument about it has been going on for a very long time, and we've been watching with interest in what happens from the senior levels of government, both federal and state, about what their commitments are to small communities. And certainly there's been strategies that have tried and died, but what we really need is some compassion into the game and to really be concerned that these people, even though they live in small communities, it is their ties to their land, and it's not as easy as many people can just make an assumption that you can just pack up your car, load it up and move to another centre. Many people like myself, we came away to start a new life in jobs and education for our children in our generation, but there are people in our community who want to stay there, and for whatever reason it is, we still have to support them. And that's where I think the compassion needs to still be at the table when we're making decisions about rural communities and certainly remote communities with high population of Aboriginal people.
Because in that mix is also the lack of understanding of cultural ties to the land.
See, the cultural ties to land where I come from, it is so strong. The cultural ties to the land where we come, even though it's Murrawari country and I'm a Gamilaroi, but we were raised on this land, and our families even today can't be buried without special permission to be buried on their land. So there's so many twists and turns to our policies have changed both at the local government, state government and federal government levels that have impacted on people. And my family, just recently, where one of our older people passed away, yet they had to go through so much of a process to try and get permission to be buried on your own land. Now, in modern time, you wouldn't think you'd be having these sorts of conversations with authorities, but unfortunately, it's still there.
And that not only is that you're going through the process of grieving, but it's adding extra trauma and burden because you're having to go through all of this unnecessary white systems that haven't built in Aboriginal cultural practices.
See, because policies are just based on people usually in a far removed place developing policy. There is not necessarily a connection to the people it impacts upon. And from my point of view, that's pretty much the history of Aboriginal affairs. It's policies that were designed by people far removed from the people who really matter. And history has shown us there's many examples. So from where I come from, I can look back in my young time, but I'm also informed by my older people that policies have impacted greatly. But what I'm most proud of is that we've had people in our families with vision about our future. And I know I'm a product of that our older people had a vision for education in early times. And when decimal currency came in and I was born, I became the product of a new vision, and it was called education. My great-grandfather said in his time that my generation wouldn't just become fencers and shearers. He wanted to see people educated. He was sick and tired of illiteracy in our family. Our family's only going to year 6 education. So things really changed. And I know that because of that vision, we now have examples of, I've got a cousin who's gone all the way to the doctorate level in education because of this commitment that he put forward as the leader of our family. But see that vision for your family, for the future. You've got to look beyond today. Governments don't necessarily do that. Governments think about electoral cycles, popular votes, and popular issues. We've got to look beyond that, and I think we have got the examples in our own families where people look far into the future about our generation, what it is that's going to sustain us. And I think what we have got now is this, we need to have such a passion for our education, for our children, and our children's children. So it's looking a long way into the future, just like my great-grandfather did. Now, he died at 102. He received his letter from the Queen to congratulate him on his 100th birthday. And even then, he didn't frame it. He didn't think it was a particular document that he needed to have. What he really wanted was recognition from his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren that they would take from him this passion for education. That was the thing. It was education and work and look after your family. Nothing about anything else. It was whatever you do, ensure that your children are in class, get a real job and look after your family. These sorts of things just instilled in our DNA. And I think if I can just carry some of those things into my life and impart that on to my children, I'm doing well.
So do you want to tell us about some of the things that you've been involved in your life, the type of work you've done to help support the progression of issues for Aboriginal people?
I think in my time of working in the public service, I've been a shearer. I've been in the public service for over 25 years, worked for the 3 tiers of government. Easily the best thing that I've ever been involved in is a program called iProud. Now, it's a program where we look to train and develop Aboriginal people to become police officers, to be part of the New South Wales Police Force. Because for me, I can see, as I look around, particularly Western New South Wales, where there's a high population of Aboriginal people, we've got very small numbers of police officers who are Aboriginal, and even less so, people who are Aboriginal and come from their own community and work as police officers in those communities. For me, it became a distinct issue back in 1997 when my sister died in police custody in Weilmoringle. Now, Weilmoringle is not where I originally come from, but it's the community where we were born. So I lived on Weilmoringle, 100 kilometres away. Weilmoringle was the nearest hospital for our people to be born. So we have a strong tie to that country too. And so when we look back, we would normally say, that's where you come from, because no one really knows where Weilmoringle is. You'd have to sort of tell people, Weilmoringle is 100 kilometres from Weilmoringle or Burke or so on. So it gives somebody who doesn't know the area a sort of geographic location, and people can start to pinpoint where you might come from. But Weilmoringle is where we're born. Sometimes we get to live there for a little while, and we have a strong association with that community. So when my sister went back there in 1997 to visit family, she unfortunately found herself in a police cell, and within a few hours was fighting for her life. The most distinct issue about this case is that the police in the local community at that time did not realise that she has family on every street corner. She has aunties 100 metres that way and 100 metres that way. So easily the best position for New South Wales Police at the time would have been offload my sister into a family care. Easily the best option, and she would still be alive today. That didn't happen. So what I tried to set out to do in the next so many years, from 1997 until 2003, was to get people to realise, people who matter, people in the most senior ranks of government, New South Wales Police, but even Aboriginal leaders, that a model for training and developing Aboriginal people needed to happen. The previous systems and the current systems does not create an opportunity for volumes of Aboriginal people to front up to New South Wales Police and asked for jobs. This program now, which was launched in Dubbo in 2008, still going right across New South Wales, with interest from other states and territories now, and even international interest for Indigenous people. It's going to make a difference. See, my grandfather said what he said to me back when he told us about education and work and looking after your family. Well, I could have taken a very negative approach when this happened with my sister. But the principles that he instilled in us is that there's something very different, and we have to take responsibility, and we've got to help make change. And now I'm a part of this program, working for TAFE New South Wales, in partnership with New South Wales Police and the Charles Sturt University in assisting our people to become police officers. Now, the vision for the future is very different what it could have been. The vision now is that in remote communities where there's high populations of Aboriginal people, we will start to change things in the future. And in 20 years' time, there's no doubt that when you drive around Western New South Wales, it'll be quite easy to identify the examples from IPRA, where you'll see Aboriginal people even being the leaders of their police stations. Now, I just hold on to this, that imagine the impact on your community then, when the leaders of your police are Aboriginal, the young people in the community who see it as a real job opportunity, the communication and relationship between New South Wales Police and Aboriginal communities improving. I can just see there's a very different agenda in the future, but we have to start something. I needed people at the time to see the long-term picture. There's no band-aid treatment for the relationship between our people and police. We all know that. There needs to be a long-term approach, and I think IPRAD is a part of it. It's certainly not the silver bullet, but it's a part of the solution, that real jobs for Aboriginal people in New South Wales Police is a start.
That's an amazing venture, because as you said, you could take instances like that, which have been like a huge impact on the extended family, and just go back and fight and be really negative with it all. But instead you've built on it, and I think in that sense you're also valuing your sister, you know, because she wouldn't have wanted that. It's probably, you know, like for her memory, it's actually better to build this new thing than to be fighting one another. It's not getting us anywhere, is it?
See, every one of us will come to a crossroad at some point in our life to make a decision. Sometimes it's not going to turn out good, but I think most times, if we make good choices about the things we want to do in our life, and it's not about leaving a legacy, but it's just about making a difference. And we, as a family, came to that crossroad just at funeral time for my sister, and we were offered the opportunity to do something very different. And I'm glad that myself and my old dad, we stood.
Do you want me to stop?
Yes, please.
So I appreciate that you've had this trauma that's come about in your family through your sister, and that really the strength of character to take that and move forward actually has come from generations of family who've given that to you. Is that something that you really feel?
I don't think there's any doubt that when I stood with my dad back in 1997 on the eve of my sister's funeral, when we were offered to do something very, very different in response to her death, that we could easily identify that we wanted to do something very positive. It was an absolute tragedy for our family. My sister had 4 children. They were all very small. She's only 28, the life ahead of her. She's the only sister out of 3 brothers and a sister. So, and I'm the eldest in my family. So we had enormous responsibility, and it could have quite easily turned a different direction. But again, we came to that crossroad very quickly that we needed to draw on a positive out of a tragedy, and there was no way that we were going to allow anything else to happen, but to build on something positive for the future. At the time, obviously, we did not know what that might be, but we knew that we didn't want to just riot in Weilmoringle. We didn't want to leave a legacy behind for Fiona and her death being associated in that way. So it took a few years, but we quite easily identified that there were very many Aboriginal people in New South Wales Police to start off with, and even less so in Western New South Wales, where high populations of Aboriginal people. But we also identified that there were, in fact, Aboriginal people from local communities who were policing back in their own towns. And we got the most support from those police officers as we sat around with them and spoke with them and asked questions about a model for training and developing. And I can just remember the cups of tea that I had with some of those people and the confidence I got from them to go and do something very different.
So I think having Aboriginal people in those positions would be massive. What is it that you think they will bring to those communities that isn't already there?
What it brings is this different approach to policing Aboriginal people. Over time, things have changed. We have not got the policies for lock-up like we used to have in generations. But what we still have is a division between Aboriginal people and police. It's historic, and it'll always be there. But what we wanted to do with a program like this is to assist the relationship to get better. We could just throw stones from the outside, or we can assist things to be improved in the future. And I don't think there's any other way than by giving somebody a job. That's the thing that changes everything. And just from talking to those Aboriginal police officers who have been giving me the advice in the early days on a program like what we now see as iProud, it was clearly in them when they were growing up that wherever they came off the Mission River bank, didn't matter. Their dream was to become a police officer, to change the way in which police would work with their local people. That's what drove them to get to where they were. And some of these people have been in the police force a long time, and they've faced all sorts of animosity, both from within their own workforce, but also out there in their own community, amongst their own family. There was just so much attitude towards this. So what they battled in their time is what we're trying to change in our time, so that we just want it to be normality, that when you drove around your community, you just see Aboriginal people who are police officers. At the moment, that's not the case. We want to change that. We want to know that in say 20 years' time, you can drive around a community like Weilmoringle and Burke and Moree and Redfern and Mount Druitt and Kempsey, and you'll just see a police force dominated by Aboriginal people. That's what we focus on, and that's what drives us every day. And I know that as we gather up people and we get into the same mindset all around New South Wales, we are on the right track. This program isn't perfect, but at least it gives our people a pathway. And what we're finding now is generations of support coming in behind these young people. Grandparents and great-grandparents who would have experienced a very different relationship with New South Wales Police are supporting their own, because when they get to graduation day, you just see this years and years of hurt maybe all coming to a different, it comes to a different environment, because they're standing alongside their proud loved one becoming a police officer. And I've just witnessed that at quite a few graduations at Golden Police Academy, and just to talk to the great-grandmothers who's standing alongside their grandsons or granddaughters to share just a little bit of insight into what's happened in their lives and how proud they are of their family becoming police. It's not rocket science, it's a very practical program. And that's why I was frustrated over many years, is why people didn't realise it was a logical approach. It became too complicated. But that's what you get when you work a lot with governments. Things can become convoluted. And just like my great-grandfather said, if you get educated, things will change. And that's what I'll try to do after the tragedy of my sister, is to get educated, to become more understanding about what happens in the government sphere, how things work, how public service works, and how you can influence change. And that's what I've tried to do, and I think that if can leave anything behind, if I can just leave anything behind, I just want to leave that with my children, is that you can make a change, but you need to get educated, both formally, while you're at school, don't waste a minute. Get the tertiary education, don't waste a minute. And then when you get into the work world, you can influence change. If you make good decisions about the future, you need to have a vision for your own life and for your family, but for your community. And I think this iProud program, is going to do this in some way, because we're seeing Aboriginal people being mustered up all around New South Wales, and the key thing is they want to become police officers so they can make a change. That's basically it. When we talk to them, they say, I've been wanting to do this all my life, even as a little girl or a little boy, because I want to see change. I want to see our kids go on to school. I want to see them get educated. I want to see them get into real jobs. And becoming a police officer, for some psychological reason, there's this thing that happens, and to see an Aboriginal person in a blue uniform just transcends a very different message like no other occupation. I'm not sure, apart from probably medicine or the teacher up the front of a classroom, something else happens in Aboriginal kids, and we just fire up and we start to see that role model. We start to understand that it can be achieved and our dreams can actually come true.
Is it also about giving a sense of power and structure back to our communities? Because if you look at our traditional times, we would have had our own law keepers. And with the impact of colonisation and the breaking down of our societies, placing people on reserves and missions and being governed by other people, that was taken away from our men and our women. So is this about also giving back that right to govern ourselves and do our own?
That's in fact the way I look at it. That's exactly how I look at it. Because if we can just get our people to sort of partake in that we are the people who can take responsibilities for our future. And just holding on to what our older people were telling us for many years is that we are the ones with the solutions to our problems, and that even though our traditional life is smashed over time, we have not lost it. We are just regaining it in many ways. And we'll never sit by and say that we've lost our cultural ties to this part of our land or this part of our family, because it's actually strengthened. And I know that through the process of training and developing young people, particularly on this program to become police officers, we see it. And we have cultural education as the front and centre of our program, because every week they start to learn more about their family, their cultural traditions, and their land in which they originally come from. It's front and centre, because we want to ensure that we're building young, strong, Indigenous police officers. So it's a real complex program in that way, but ideally, but essentially, it's about that they will take their rightful place in reducing crime in the future, because they'll have the communication and the relationship with their own families and their communities in which they'll work. The locking up mentality it's gone, it's finished. There's a different way of policing, and we are a part of this new environment now, and we will be such an asset for New South Wales Police. And I know that that's the way New South Wales Police see it. The Commissioner of New South Wales Police today is Mr. Scipione, and he said that on many, many occasions when I've heard him speak, that the training and developing and the employing of Aboriginal people into his police force will make the biggest impact in the policing of Aboriginal people in communities. And that's what we're all a part of. And just at our level, when we see these young people particularly coming out of their communities, even from the most remote communities, saying, this is what I wanted to do my whole life, and it wasn't the flight of the moon, it just was to wear a blue uniform, because I think it can have the most impact for my family and my community, and we're a part of it. So, you know, the decision that my dad and I made back when we had the tragedy with my sister, we can now see that we've sort of vindicated in some way that it could have been a very different outcome had we made a different decision, but we could see the future, and now we can see that there is a legacy after Fiona's death, that we have done something very positive. And to actually be a part of it now, working for TAFE, you sort of bring that personal love to your work, and the passion that sort of drives you, you can make it constructive and can see and pass on and try and inspire others to overcome some of their barriers, because every one of us, we will have tragedy in our life. But we have to find something, that resilience to overcome and to be able to look at tomorrow, not just today. And that is the thing that we want to hold on to, but we have to impart it. You can't just hold it personally, it has to be imparted, because we are a part of inspiring our young people to do something different in their life. And not every one of our students who come through this program is going to be a police officer. But if we can inspire them that you can overcome whatever barrier, if it's a literacy barrier, you can get through it. If it's a personal issue, we can overcome it. We've had students lose up to 60 kilos in a 12-month period, because to get through this barrier to achieve their dream, that is evidence that once you touch something inside these young people, they can achieve anything. And we just have to give people an opportunity, but put them in an environment where they're encouraged, there's no negative talk, and they're in an environment where someone says, no matter what it is, whatever your barrier, we want to work with you and you can overcome it. And I know because I've experienced it. So when you know something and you know that you know that you know, you can then pass it on because you feel that. And the tragedy of my sister and the death in relation to police and so on is a very good example about how we can turn something from a negative into a positive.
I hope you don't mind me saying this, but as you were talking and you were telling me that you had the support of the police, therefore the structure was behind you, which is absolutely vital. If you don't have that structural support, that creates another barrier. But I also could feel the old fellas, and it's almost like they're directly behind you and they're saying, this is what you've got to do, and we're supporting you and want you to do it. Is that something that you feel as well?
All of us have the most influential people in our background, and grandmothers, grandfathers and greats are the people who just instilled in us that you have to be a part of a very different community in the future. You cannot just fill up our jails. You cannot be the ones who just draw on welfare. You have to be the ones who have strong families and strong focus on education and strong focus on positive things. And I know that when I stood with my dad on the day we made the decision about the issue with Fiona, honestly, you could just be absolutely assured that it was just like your old people standing alongside you, because they were showing you the right way to go. And even now, when we come up against barriers within structures, whether it's government or whatever it may be in communities, we know that the old people have given us the strong advice about this is the track to walk on. And every one of us at some point will sit on our own and wonder what we're going to do next. What I draw on is certainly from what my old people have taught me. And just to be able to spend time in my generation with my great-grandfather particularly, and my grandfather on my mother's side, just to spend time with them, to be taught some of the principles of life. My grandfather, my mum's father, was one of the best shearers in Western New South Wales. But he was much more than that. People just recognised him for his shearing ability. But what he was able to impart in his grandkids was something very different. And I held on to those things. It was about respect. He shore 5 days a week, but he almost wore a three-piece suit for 7 days a week. He was the most amazing man, and he'd dress up in this three-piece suit to go uptown. And I remember asking him one day, because it was 55 degrees in Burke, and asked him, he said it was passed on from his grandfather and his great-grandfather, that the dressing up at that time in their era was a part of being respected in your community. And the general community saw you very different if you were. And so I get to see this now, even in my generation, some of those older people still walking around our city here in Dubbo, and they carry that too. I instantly identify it with the era that they would have grown up in, because it was very different for them. But isn't it interesting now that in our time we can try and get our kids, young people, out of the baggy shorts and the American cultural dress? They say, well, this is a $70 pair of shorts. It's not worth $2. But our grandfathers would have paid $2 for a suit at St. Bino's, yet they look very different to the young person in the $70 pair of shorts. It's just this thing that I confront sometimes, and it just gets me to reflect a little. But that structure in your community, that strong structure where you come from with your older people giving you advice about what it is that the decisions you make in the community and which way it's run, even goes on to things like domestic violence, and it just goes right into the substance abuse issues, and our things start to fall away when the structure is smashed. And unfortunate as it is, we can just see it, and it's replicated throughout our society today. It's certainly more evident in local, regional and remote communities, because it's there, it's front and centre of what you see every day, and that structure has been shattered. And we need to draw on what it is that our older people have taught us and instilled in us, and hold on to that. Keep it in our own family first, and start to help other people get that structure back, that we take responsibility. Mum, dad and children, safe bed to sleep in, food in the fridge, school, work and so on, and those things start to come. But unfortunately, that's not the case for many people all around our country, and in fact internationally. It's the structure that we need to get back to, and in trying to sort of influence our young people now about getting this into their life, that it's not just about yourself, it's about your family and your community, that you've got a responsibility. And so it's much more than just a training and developing program for becoming police officers. In fact, we're training and developing people, and we want to impart through all the skilled people and knowledge that we can gather around these young people, easily the most effective advice is going to come from our elders. And just linking them up with elders from this community who sit and tell them stories about their lives and what they've experienced in terms of policing and growing up and access to jobs and education and welfare and so on. These young people start to understand that they live in a very different environment in our modern time. And we are reaping the benefits from the tough walk that our elders have trod in the past to where we are today. We wouldn't have a program like we've got now if it wasn't for the hard yakka of our elders in the past who took it to governments and took it to influential people at the time. And you can go right back in history and have a look at the people who've made impact at the political level, that things needed to be different for Aboriginal people in generations to come. And that's what we are a part of now. We have to look at what we benefited from, how can we influence for generations to come as well. So that's the responsibility, unfortunately, and that's just it. I mean,
but what you're actually talking about is building back in the traditions that we had in the past, where every single person had reciprocal responsibilities for caring for their family, caring for their country, caring for one another, but also that ethical structure. And you're allowing our kids to regain that. They can see what their role would be. And I think that's an amazing opportunity, and allowing our kids to grow and have that place.
Because we've all got the responsibility. I heard a leader say one time that we should be ashamed of ourselves as Aboriginal leaders in our communities because of what's happening with our young people. And he wasn't saying it, I don't think, to pour cold water over all of us. He was getting it, pour cold water over us to wake us up, to say we have got the responsibility for our young people. It's not the police, the courts and the jails. They'll look after our young people if we give them access to it. But what they need to access is all the knowledge and the support and the structure that comes from within your own family and your community, and that how we impart that onto them. So we're taking responsibility from that side. So in a little program like IPRAD, where we're on a pathway, students are on a pathway to become police officers, we also put this other structure around them, put them in a safe environment that you've got elders like Uncle John Hill here in Dubbo, 85-year-old Wiradjuri man, talking to young people about the history of police and Aboriginal people in his time to what it is today, and the opportunity that they're on. Like Tracker Riley, the story behind him, these students start to unpack some of this and they think, man, so if he went through that in his time and he got to this point, and look at all the opportunities that I've got, and I'm not holding on with both hands. And they are part of history, and we want our students to sort of start to unpick this and start to get inspired from the stories of people from the past. But their stories are as relevant today as it was in their time. And so we just show them that you are in a safe environment, one where there's a launching pad to a very positive future. And please don't defend your right to welfare. Vigorously defend your right to great education in a good environment, and anything's possible. And if it's to become a police officer, if that's your dream, why don't you dream to become the Commissioner of New South Wales Police as well? Why don't you aspire to be the Prime Minister of our country? And this starts to open up this other paradigm for our young community. And also imparting back on them their responsibility in the way that they conduct themselves in their family and in their community as well. So you have this different layers of responsibility. So you're saying you're stepping up to this mark. Well, with that becomes a responsibility, just like our elders and people like Tracker Riley in the past. What they did in their time is passing on another responsibility to you. So don't lose sight of that. Hold on to it and use it to inspire yourself. So when things get difficult, you can say, people have trod this path as well, and I can learn from them.
if anybody is to come out and work, particularly non-Indigenous people working with Aboriginal people or in Aboriginal communities, what message would you give them?
The most important information you're going to get if you come to work in communities where there's high populations of Aboriginal people is to take your time to develop relationships with the local people. See, the story about my sister's death back in Weilmoringle in '97 just highlights the point. As I read through all the documentation leading into her case, in the inquiry into her death, there was only one little statement through all the mountains of paperwork. I highlighted it and I've still got it with me today. And it said this: the question was asked of the local police officer, why was Fiona placed in a cell? And the answer then was, because she was not local. So in that little response, for me, things were just really I was overwhelmed by it, because that is where she came from. The police officer wasn't local. He may have been stationed there for a year or two, but he did not regard her as local, because her name wasn't familiar to him, but she was familiar to 99% of that small community. So that for me is something you need to carry yourself. You work out in communities, wherever you are, you need to understand who you're working with. And if you're in the medical field and you've got an auntie sitting with a young fella in your surgery, that is a part of their story. If you're a teacher and you're sitting in a classroom and there's behind that group of students you're in front of is a whole history of family and heritage. Wherever it is, whatever, if you're a docks worker, if you're in community services or you're a police officer or you're in medicine, the story is the same. The people you've got in front of you, there's an old history and story behind them and an old connection to another world that you need to get connected to. And it's your responsibility really, so that you just don't see that person just as an individual. Because when you work with Aboriginal people, it's much more than that, and you need to understand it. And I know that police today, when I use the story about iProud and what inspires us to do something very different, they can see it. So when they lock up people now, or when they arrest people today, the story is very different. Well, we're hoping it to be the case anyway, because that's what it's about. It's about education, you see. And for you in your profession, you need to just understand it, that the person in front of you, there's a family involved, and but you can take the positive side of that. That is support for you as a professional, that you can alleviate the problem that you may be faced with by working with a broader community. And the great thing about working in the Aboriginal community is that we have a strong family network, and you can tap into that for your own benefit. And I know that if we can go back in time and see, if we take this education that we're talking about now back into the police station in Weilmoringle in 1997, the outcome will be very different. You come into contact with a person, you've got an issue, how can you alleviate it? You go to family, and she could have been dropped off on any street in Weilmoringle to a family, to a direct family, aunties, on both mother and father's side, and she'd still be alive today. Absolute no doubt about that. So I think there's a real story in education about how you work with Aboriginal people, so wherever you are in whatever profession.
Thank you.